Hello and welcome back to Reading Rule, y'all. I'm Dr. Shay Parton, and today I have the immense joy and honor of interviewing Pedro Brown Hoffmeister. He's published under Peter, but word has it that he's publishing under Pedro next. So we're going with Pedro. He is the author of 5 books so far: The End of Boys, Let Them Be Eaten by Bears, A Fearless Guide to Taking Our Kids into the Great Outdoors, Graphic the Valley, This Is the Part Where You Laugh, and the book that we'll be talking a little bit about today, Too Shattered for Mending. His novels have earned starred reviews from Kirkus Reviews, Booklist, Publishers Weekly, School Library Journal, Voya, and The Bulletin. This Is the Part Where You Laugh was a School Library Journal popular pick selected for the Voya Perfect 10's 2016 year-end list and earned an ALA distinction for Best Fiction of 2016. And Too Shattered for Mending was named Best Fiction list of 2017 by Bank Street. He's a former troubled teen who was expelled from 3 high schools, lived in a Greyhound bus station, and was remanded to a recovery and parole program and completed a wilderness experience for troubled youth. He founded the integrated outdoor program, serving teens of all backgrounds and getting them into nature, which is fantastic. He's also a rock climber, outdoor expert, gear tester, and literature and creative writing teacher at South Eugene High School in Eugene, Oregon, where he lives. And in 2018, this is the coolest. Everything about Pedro's bio is amazing, but this thing is the coolest. In 2018, he beat a world record holding 3-time world champion speed climber in a 3,000-foot rock climbing race, setting a new record. He's clearly one of the coolest people you'll ever meet, and I am tickled to death to be talking with him today. Thank you so much for being here with us, Pedro.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. Jaya.
Yeah. Yep. So I always start out, because place and rurality are sort of, the focus of the work that I do. And I'm just interested in knowing more about where you're from and how that's impacted who you are as a person and an author.
That's a good question. I think the place that impacted me the most is Tucson, Arizona. We lived north of Tucson, moved into a house north of Tucson when I was 6, and my dad decided to go back to school. And so there were 4 kids, and he was going to school at the University of Arizona. And so we were living out on some land where he could find a really, really cheap place to live out in the mountains, in the desert mountains, in the foothills of the Santa Catalinas. And so he wasn't making any money. So we were on food stamps, and we were within a church-like food program, but also we would supplement because my mom would drive our Volvo up to the Safeway dumpster, and I would jump in once a week, and we would get whatever was outdated. And so it was kind of like a really adventure time in my life with my family. And I didn't really understand that that was the time that we were maybe the poorest, but but it was like an exciting time for me. My mom didn't like the school that I went to for one day, so she pulled me out of school. So then I didn't go back to school until I was a high school student. So I didn't adjust socially very well, but I had so much fun being in the desert. And the house we were in was on 7 acres, but then it abutted more desert and then the mountains. And so I would just run and explore every day. And my mom loved books and would read aloud to us endlessly. And we were sort of homeschooled and sort of unschooled at the same time. And I just loved the desert, and I loved all the space and all the personal time and being alone out there. And sometimes I'd run around with my siblings, but a lot of time it was just me exploring. So that place had a big effect on who I was as a person.
Yeah. I'm glad that you bring up the desert as a rural place, because I feel like so much of the dominant narrative, the popular narrative of what rural looks like, is either Appalachia or cornfields, or right. I feel like frontier spaces and desert spaces get ignored a lot. And so I think, having that and introducing that as a type of rural that exists in the world and that people live in places like that is really important. We often go to Big Bend, and so we end up going through Terlingua,
Yeah,
And
it's so pretty.
we frequently look for like land out there, because BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, is often selling land out there, and it's not useful, right? So
Yeah,
so it can be pretty cheap. But as you were talking about being in the desert and being at the foothills of desert mountains and stuff, that's Terlingua is kind of like what came up in my mind. And it's just there's just something about the openness and
yeah,
being able
yeah,
to see for miles and see the mountains and the dark sky and the stars at night. And there's just something about it that just speaks, I feel like, to a person in a different way than any.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I wanted my daughters to have that experience, but I lived in Oregon now and teach in Eugene. So we actually drive over the mountains and go to BLM land, just like you. And there are some boulders out on this BLM parcel on an elk preserve that we've been going to for the last let's see, 15 years. And we usually we camp out there like 20 or 30 nights a year. And we're just out. It's the Great Basin Desert, so it's a different desert than the Sonoran Desert that I knew when I was a kid. But it's beautiful, and there's the big open sky and no light pollution and stars and the moon, and obviously there's elk and mountain lions and cottontails, and it's just like really cool experience for them too, and for me to have that experience with them. So that was like really important that I passed that on.
How do you feel like the place of the Sonoran Desert, um, how do you feel like that shaped who you wanted to be as a writer and the kind of stories you wanted to tell?
Well, this is gonna sound kind of funny, but like you know, when you're a kid, you're always told that deserts are barren.
Mm.
But if you live in a desert, you're like, that's not true at all. And this is getting pretty nerdy, but I think about just like saguaro cactuses,
Mhm.
which are kind of that emblem of the Southwest.
Mhm.
And the saguaro is only in one desert in the world. Of the 33 deserts in the world, there's one that has a saguaro. And there are so many saguaros that just in Saguaro National Park, there's 1.9 million, right? And I read this study where University of Arizona professors took 1 foot of rotting saguaro and found 413 different animals living in that 1 foot, mostly arthropods, beetles and different things. But just like if the average saguaro is 40 feet tall and 1 foot has 413 lives in it, I always think like if you slow down and really look around, there's so much all around us. And that kind of mantra to slow down and look around and listen, pay attention, that really affected me as a person, but also affects me as a writer because like I spend a lot of time trying to like slow down and look around and listen, like in trying to write the ending for Too Shattered for Mending. I spent 3 weeks going out in my backyard every single day after work and just sitting out there for an hour or two and just thinking and watching bees and birds and um, looking at the grass and the flowers and just trying to think like how I could possibly, end the book in a way that did justice to the rest of the book. And it was really difficult for me, but I had to spend a lot of quiet time thinking.
Yeah, and I think the sort of push to observe the frequently unobserved, right? Like, so from my perspective and hearing you talk about it, thinking about how rural people and rural lives are so frequently ignored, we're some of those 400 and whatever species living in this foot of saguaro cactus, and everybody sort of just ignores
Yeah.
us, for whatever reason, whether it's because they believe we're all conservative, white, racist homophobes clinging to guns and Bibles, or if they just don't really think that they don't even think about rural people, or like that,
Yeah.
because we get so into like our own lives, and we get so sort of like the blinders on and focused on like, this is my experience and so this must be everyone else's experience, but that's not true. And so I think in the work that you're doing and the work of the other authors that I've talked to, and will hopefully continue to talk to, does that, right? Like it sort of brings visibility to lives that are usually rendered invisible.
Yeah, and I mean, probably the coolest series of fan letters I've ever gotten was from this kid from Iowa who, after he read Two Shattered from Ending in his library at school, he started writing me these notes saying like, Little's the first character that was me, you know? And so, and then it just kind of devolved into us sending like fishing pictures back and forth, or like him sending a picture of his knife or whatever. But it was cool that like he finally found a character that was him, in a book. And you know, it's my book's set in Idaho, but I think some of those like kind of forgotten rural towns like Pierce, Idaho, which is a real place, but like
Mhm.
some of those towns are just kind of like very similar in different ways. And being a teenager in one of those towns has got to be hard sometimes, but like beautiful at the same time, And so it's like, is it harder than living in a city? I don't know. And I don't think so. I just think like it's hard to be a teenager and you're trying to figure out your place in the world. And, lots of teenagers want to leave and some teenagers want to stay. And I'm more the kind of person that wants to stay and keep trying to be better at whatever I do. And so I wanted to write a teenager that wanted to stay.
And I think that's important to see because I think that, we talked a little bit about this before we started recording, like the sort of rural hero narrative is one where the rural person leaves and becomes somebody outside of their rural place. And I know that I believed that. I mean, the refrain in my high school, my senior year was, we got to get out of this one stoplight town. It wasn't even a real stoplight. Like it was a blinking 4-way stop. All it really needed was a stop sign. Like, I don't even know why the light was there, but that's the one we had, and there were like 2 bars and no grocery stores and 1 restaurant and 1 gas station,
Yep.
and it was not unusual to see someone riding around on an ATV with a gun strapped to the, just like you
Yeah.
talk about in your author's note. That was a recognizable thing for me. I'm like, yeah, people do that all the time. Like, I grew up
Oh,
on
yeah.
80 acres. 50 of it was tillable, 30 of it was woods, and people were frequently asking to hunt in the woods. And my stepdad bow hunted, and like, like it was just, that's just, I had that same sort of recognition that the fan that sent you that letter did. Like this is there's some parts about this that are me, like this is a mirror for me. When most of the texts that I read in high school were windows, always
Mm.
looking into someone else's experience. I got to see my whiteness in books a lot, but I didn't usually get to see my class position, especially not represented in like a nuanced, kind way that didn't put you at the butt of a joke, or my rurality, and so
Yeah.
in a contemporary way. I mean, in canonical fiction, but it's just like, even in things like Of Mice and Men, like the rural is pathologized. And so I just think that writing against that and pushing back against that, so that fans like the fan you described, and for for readers like me, like being able to see that there are multiple ways of being, and one of those ways is staying.
Hmm.
You can also leave. You can leave and come back.
Hmm. Yeah.
It's, you have to make the decision that's right for you, and you have to make the decision for the right reason, but don't just leave because all of society tells you that you think you have to leave.
Right. And I think we're also combating the American narrative too,
Right.
that bigger is better. So if there's more people, it must be better. But I mean, my personal hell would be living in Los Angeles. So, as my daughter puts it, 100 miles of concrete, and I don't want that at all. I'm always looking for space.
Mhm.
And like, so my characters are always looking for space. Like in my novels, like this first novel, my main character is in the Yosemite Valley and living out of a car, and like in this one, which was the book right before Two Shattered, he's living with his grandmother as she's dying in a trailer park, but like he's always going out on this lake and he's finding space at the lake. And like, I always related to and felt like I needed more space. And so, um, rural places just kind of made sense to me. And so when I spent a lot of time in Pierce, Idaho, and I asked my father-in-law, who's the mayor of Pierce, which is kind of a dubious title, but he said, "Yeah, I think this would be a great town for a novel." He didn't mean the kind of novel that I write, which is like a gritty, realistic novel, because Pierce is a meth town,
Mhm.
and 2/3 of the houses are abandoned, and there's a lot of sadness and struggle. But there's a lot of beauty even in that struggle, and that's what I wanted to write. And he didn't want me to write that book, but you can't make your family happy, so.
I just I just am thinking about your author's note, and I really appreciated your author's note. And I'm finding, I said this in my last, I think I said this in either the video that's about to come out or the video that came out last week, that I never used to read author notes. I think I just kind of like, assumed it was kind of like the acknowledgments and just like sort of like glossed over it. And I know that I'm missing so much good stuff now from all of these books that I read because I didn't read the author's note. But I really appreciated the way that you explicitly address why you said it, where you said it, and like the role that the place plays in the story. And I've been thinking a lot about like how I think I anthropomorphize place a lot as like a character, but I think it's so much more than that. And I think the wilderness aspect specifically of your book as compared to some of the other books that I've talked about really highlights that. Like the way that humans try to remove themselves as part of the ecology. Like
Mhm.
little is definitely part of the ecology as chickens
Yeah.
keep disappearing. Like you know, there's something about the natural and the way that you situate humanity in the natural and part of the natural, and um whether the symbiosis is working or not. I think that speaks to some of the beauty I think that you are talking about, in contrast to some of the maybe less beautiful aspects of the place.
Yeah, for me, it felt natural that Little was trying to make sense of the world through his experiences outside, and he'd been taught these real skills by other people who also understood the outdoor world. And that's one of the cool things about Pierce is, it was a gold mining town and it was a logging town, and people were working hard outside, but they were also recreating outside. And so their work and their recreation were both outdoors in this like rugged locale. And so they understood the natural world a lot more than, city environmentalists kind of imagine that they understand the world. Well, my friend who's a logger, he said like if you really go outside every day, then you understand how effing bad poison oak is, like and he says, the city environmentalists always get those things wrong. Like they romanticize everything about the outdoors, and it's like, well, some things are terrible, and if you spend a lot of time outside, you're gonna struggle with that too. But that can build a lot of character. And I think Little has character. It's just that he's not successful in school. And so he doesn't think he's succeeding in life. And thankfully, he has that wonderful special ed teacher who I based on my friend who's a sped teacher, Brian Nagaski. And, just kind of like pouring into him, like, hey, this is not the only way to be successful in this world. And I think Little is trying to be a good human, you know.
I think the complexity that you really capture through all of that is really important. Like we hold more than one thing. We hold multitudes, right? Well, women. Like, do I contradict myself? So be it. I contain
Mhm.
multitudes. And I think that really exists in Little and in the book as a whole. I mean, JT, like there's so much about JT that I just really wanted to like not like him. But at
Yeah.
the same time, like there's something about him, like he's still trying. He's still there for Little in a lot of ways. And I think that that is really important. I mean, I think the complexity that you bring to family relationship, even Lucky and Darlene, like Darlene, I just, but then at the end when she's talking to Little, I don't want to give any spoilers away, but she sort of does him a kindness, and that I didn't expect, right?
Yeah.
From
She was,
her
and
especially.
she was based on a real person in my life who really helped me, but was also a horribly flawed person.
Right.
And I remember, that moment was really just stolen from real life, where that real person in my life was sitting there chain smoking and just giving, yeah,
Yeah.
I won't spoil anything either. But I mean, I steal from real life all the time because we have so many good, complex people around us all the time.
Hmm. And it's easy
And
to fixate on either the good or the bad without
yeah,
acknowledging the other. And so I think that the complexity of that you bring to all of that, um, in this book is really important.
I think that's what's good about complex stories is that you can't just make a character one thing.
Right.
And that's what I want to be as a storyteller, somebody who writes complex characters.
Well, I think you've definitely succeeded in this book. I'll read your
Thank
other
you.
ones and I'll let you know.
Okay.
um, but another thing that I really, because of the work that I do, another thing about this book that I really appreciated was Little's commentary on school and the way that teachers, especially there's one teacher who talks about how it's hard to teach trailer trash basically,
Yeah.
because they went to some fancy school in California, and sort of that idea of like the knowledges, the ways of being, the ways of interacting in the world, of rural people, of multiple class layerings and racial identities get like positioned and situated within schools, by teachers is also something that I definitely want to take up in the work that I'm doing. And so I really appreciated hearing Little and seeing Little's interactions in school and thinking about even myself as a teacher and the ways that I do or don't support um, certain students in certain ways because of my own biases, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was really lucky because I lived two lives. When I was little, we didn't have any money. And then by the time I was 14, my dad was a doctor.
Mhm.
Like I didn't live in that situation very long because I had my own problems with my parents and ended up leaving multiple times when I was 15 and 16, and then finally just didn't live with them anymore at all. Um, but I did have like some time periods where it was like we had money, and then time periods where we're on food stamps. And so I really got to live like two different economic experiences, and that helped inform me as a writer. And then I hated high school. And like you said in the intro, I was expelled from three high schools and arrested and sent to a troubled teens program and sent to a parole program in Texas, which I ran from. And like, it was just like, I was a mess. And like, as a 17-year-old, I would have never believed that I was going to become a high school teacher. But now I am a high school teacher. So like, I'm really lucky that I got to experience those different lives. And I even like in some strange ways was lucky. Like I was a wrestler and I was gonna wrestle for Stanford. But then I got expelled multiple times and arrested, and they dropped their interest in me, and U of O picked me up, University of Oregon, the like local state school, which is nowhere near as good a school supposedly as Stanford. But I had wonderful creative writing, poetry professors. Dorian Locks is one of the most important people in my life, still to this day, you know, and her poetry mattered so much to me. And I was in her advanced poetry workshop, and I was the worst writer in the workshop. And and so I was the worst every week as we read stuff. And so that was really good. Like being bad at something was really good, and failing was really good. And all of that, like lack of success, really helped me as a teacher, and I hope helped me as a writer.
I always tried to think about like because I had sort of an opposite experience, like I was the golden child and I'm the oldest of five, and my siblings were always mad because she was always perfect and she always made the right decision, and they were all measured against me, and I was valedictorian in my class and blah, blah, blah. Right.
Wow.
There were only, not to not to make it, not to diminish my experience or whatever, but there were only 50 kids. But yeah, so like I just always did my best to try to do everything right. But when I struggle with something, I have a really hard time. Like I just want to give up. Like I don't, I see it as like a personal flaw and not necessarily that I'm just like trying to learn like a new skill. Like I tried to pick up drawing and I have very little spatial reasoning skills. And my husband is an amazing artist and his stuff is so good. And he tried to teach me 3D techniques like one time. And I was like, I'm terrible at this. I give up. And he's like, this is the first day that you're working on it. Like, I don't understand. If I'm not good at it right away, I'm not good at it. I'm not going to be good at it. I'm just going to give up. And he's like, that's ridiculous. And he took an art class every year of high school. He has very, very good spatial reasoning skills,
Yeah.
But it's that like attitude of like, I didn't have to confront failure very often. Because I was just good at what traditional schooling asked of you. And it's not like, I don't know, like I just felt like I never really had to work very hard and stuff. Like I just understood traditional schooling and I was really good at performing that, especially after I realized that like my working class language was not recognized or seen as appropriate. I've worked really hard to unlearn it, and that went pretty good. And then I got really good at academic language, and like here I am with a PhD when my great grandfathers didn't even know how to read and write. I think that there's something to be said for struggle, and I don't think that it's not validated, it's not acknowledged, it's not seen as good. But I think the way that we see the characters in Too Shattered for Mending, and the way that you talk about your experience, like there's something to be said, for being the worst, for failing, for struggling. There's something good about that, because you're going to struggle at some point in your life, whether it's drawing 3D or it's, like, in other ways, like, and you have to, it's better to cultivate a strength to get through it than my strategy, which is often just to abandon things that I might find joy in, just because I'm mad at them.
Yeah, writing didn't come naturally to me. I didn't do well in English classes. In graduate school, I remember my first essay that I turned in, I got an F. Yeah, I know that's scary for a valedictorian to hear that. But I rewrote it, and earned a B. And he let me rewrite it. And, I know I'm being like falsely modest when I say I was a bad writer when I started writing. Like I was really, really bad. My friend Jose Chavez, he was writing a memoir while I was trying to write my first novel. And I took 2 years writing and revising this novel, and I gave it to him. And he read it, and then we met at, a coffee shop to talk about it. And he was like, this is really bad, and I was like, yeah, but it can be saved. And he was like, no, it's too terrible to be saved, and he was like, you should write. Yeah, you should write what's true. He's like, you have really good stories, and you should write your memoir first and really tell the truth. And then you can learn to take the truth and make it valuable in a novel. And so I just took his advice and I abandoned that entire book. And then I wrote 521 pages of awful memoir after that. But it was savable, and eventually 13 drafts later, it was 212 pages and like a published book. And so it was really good for me to struggle as a writer, because I think I had to work harder and really build skills and think about precision. And because I was just like sloppy and quick, and I did, and I didn't get a graduate degree in writing. I didn't do an MFA, so I don't have like all of those graduate school mentors that taught me all those things. Like, I wrote with Michael McGriff, the poet, and I loved his poetry. And Dorianne Locks was wonderful to me, but she was a poet, and I write some poems, but I'm mostly a novelist. So, like, I just had to fail a lot, and failing was good for my learning process. So, like, as a teacher, I'm always looking at like kids, and if they're not good at something, they'll tell me they're not good at it, and I'll be like, yeah, well, that doesn't mean anything.
And a lot of times for me, like, I don't even know what a draft wants to be until it's like really, really crappy the first time, like you
Hmm.
have to have material to work with, first of all. And I think that's another thing that, like, and I've talked, I think, to all of the authors that I've interviewed about this, like the revision process for like working authors is quite a bit different than what we teach high school
Hmm.
students to do. And
Yeah.
so the idea of like revision as just like looking for typos was sort of like what I understood about revision until I started in a program that uses Writing Workshop and talks about revision as like literally re-envisioning what it is that you have,
Yes.
and how important that is to the work that you're doing, and to make the piece the best that it can be. And so I think that that's really important too, right? Like because in standardized testing, you want to give your best draft in the least amount of time possible. And so to instill that as like that's what writing is into students in classrooms, like no, that's not what writing is. It's not what you should want it to be. And so like hearing you talk about that process of learning, like taking something through and re-envisioning what it can look like time and time again, you're going to get such a more powerful draft and
Hmm.
maybe published work than you would if you took sort of like the standardized testing approach to your writing.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many weird things about school, like kids asking you if they can pee, but also standardized tests. I mean, I did get accepted to one of the best MFA programs in the country, Montana, and I wanted to go there because it was like a combination of great professors and a lot of wide open space in Missoula. And we were about to go there, but then I took my GRE for like my placement for my TA position to be a GTF and to teach intro writing and everything. And I aced the math and I did all right on the reading and I failed the writing. And so they pulled my funding and they were like, well, we're not going to let you teach intro writing, because you didn't write a great first draft on a GRE test that was timed, and and I'm not a good first draft writer. So like a standardized test is never going to work out for me if you're asking me to write something because I'm not going to do a good job. I mean, now I've been a professional writer for a long time and I probably would still do badly on a GRE writing test. I don't know. But some people are very good at that, but like, do they also know how to like you said, re-envision? And so, so I didn't go to Montana because I didn't do well on one portion of one standardized test, and that was worth $70,000 in funding, you know? And so I think like still having kids take PSATs and
Mm.
SATs. When it was PSAT day for my daughters, I told them to skip school. And I was proctoring the PSAT. So, but it's a terrible system and we shouldn't buy into it, right? And who does it honor? It honors mostly white privileged city people who are very good at doing things quickly.
There's a really great Jason Isbell. I don't know if you're a Jason Isbell fan, but there's a great piece recently where he was telling a story about how in like I can't remember what grade he was in, but he was doing one of those like reading counts quizzes or whatever about a book that they read, and there's a true false question, and the question included I can't remember which way it is, but the question asked about buckshot, but the book was about birdshot, and so he answered false, but the quiz wanted it to be true, and he like argued with his teacher, um and for a long time that like it can't possibly be true because the character in the
Buckshot and
book is
birdshot are not the same thing.
birdshot. Exactly. He knew, he grew up hunting. He knew that those two things were not the same thing, that they were two totally different things. And ended up getting like suspended or something because he just wouldn't let it go. He just kept arguing about it because he was just incensed that like this teacher didn't understand or like wouldn't give him the point or whatever. And I loved him before, but after that story, I loved him even more.
Yeah,
But
that's so
again,
great.
just sort of like illustrating the sort of like metrocentricness of testing, of questions like that, and how, you know, based on where we're from and how we've grown up and what we know about the world, situations like that can arise because, or we may not even understand what a question's asking because it's talking about the subway and like you don't even have a bus system and you know there
Yeah.
ain't even any buses in where you're from, you know.
Yeah,
um
and I mean, like, who gets to decide that, like, knowing 3 different types of fishing is less important than knowing how to ride a subway? I mean, but they
right,
do. They get
right.
to decide.
I loved that little, even as much as he loved being outdoors and you know, sort of the things that get positioned as less than, you know, like reading great literature or whatever, he still loved stories, you know.
Yeah.
And he still worked to learn a second language, and he, you know what I mean, like there were academic pursuits that he enjoyed. And so like one of the things that drove me crazy teaching in a rural school in Indiana was that my students who wanted to be welding apprentices or wanted to run their family farm or wanted to be a mechanic or whatever, thought that they couldn't like my class and that they couldn't like reading because those kind of people don't like those. And I'm like, dude, you can be a mechanic and enjoy reading good stories. Like I,
Yep.
you know, like you can be, you know, you can be out on your combine during harvest and take a break to read a poem. Like, you know,
Mhm.
my grandparents came from the hills of East Tennessee, and one of my grandfather's prized possessions was a poetry book that he was given upon his high school graduation. I mean,
That's so cool.
the cover was worn, like he read it all the
Yep.
time. And he and my uncle Leroy love to read westerns. Like they, but like when people think about hillbillies, which is how we would identify, is they think illiterate. They think, you know what I mean? But
Yep.
they love to read. So anyway,
Oh, yeah, no, so as a teacher, you know, because 'cause I've been a teacher for a while, I had 3 student teachers, and they were all terrible. And so I decided I was never gonna have a student teacher again. But then, a student from my freshman English class from 14 years ago hit me up on email, and he was like, "Hey, I always loved you in the class and everything we talked about and the books we'd read, and I really love to read, and I'm finishing my senior year in college, but I'm 29 and I've been a mechanic for the last 11 years. And I really like going outside and I like weightlifting. And I really think I like books though the most. Can I be your student teacher?" And I was like, yes. And so Jack Carpenter was my student teacher. And I mean, he spoke English and Spanish, and he had all these funny stories about fixing cars and interacting with customers and like weightlifting tournaments, and like was just a completely different thing as a literature student teacher. And I mean, and now he's a teacher. He's been a teacher the last 2 years, and he's 31 years old, and he spent 11 years being a mechanic and now 2 years being a teacher. And he's going to definitely be the best teacher of all my student teachers ever, you know. And I think kids are looking for something different,
mhm.
and just because you're a welder for 10 years doesn't mean you can't then go back and be a professor, like, and that'd probably be a cooler professor, you know.
Some of the best teachers in my life were family members who either farmed or, you know, worked the factory. Like,
Hmm.
you know, like
Yep.
they didn't have,
Yep.
you know, not to diminish, obviously, I mean, I'm in the teaching game. Like, I
Yeah.
think pedagogy is good and important and stuff, but I think that there are definitely life experiences. Like, just like we bring our life experiences to the books that we read, we also bring our life's experiences to the work we do with students. And so the more that we understand a little McCardle, um, you know, the better teacher we're going to be. And when you grow up with an intersectional identity that is privileged at every intersection, then
Yeah.
it's really hard for you to understand students who come from backgrounds that are different than yours, that experience more barriers than you. And so I think, yeah, I think we need a more representative teaching population.
And our systems are biased.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, so I taught ninth grade English for 10 years and I loved it. Um, until the school switched me into something else, which was, their choice. But I loved working with ninth graders because I got to be their first experience in high
Yeah.
school. And our high school is really funny because it draws from a place called the South Hills, which is like $1 million homes,
Mm.
and then the Glenwood, which is the one of the poorest districts in the state. It's just like a few trailer parks and some warehouses, and the city dump is there. And so we have kids who like, you'll have a kid who drives to school in a BMW and a kid whose mom has been unemployed his whole entire life. And so I had one of these like a real tough Glenwood kid who was a wrestler, and we really hit it off because I was a wrestler. And he was getting bullied in his other classes, not in my class, because luckily I had enough you know, social capital that they wouldn't make fun of him in my class because I seemed to like him. So he was okay in my class, but he was getting bullied in other classes. And I was hearing this, and I went to the admin and said, this isn't okay. This kid needs help and support. And one day he snapped and he just, these kids were making fun of him and he just beat them all up in the hall. And then the school wanted to not suspend him, but expel him. And so he'd just be gone forever. And I was like, so we'd teach him that he can be consistently bullied for 2 months. And like a teacher can even go to the admin and say, like, we need to help him. Nothing happens. He continues to be bullied. And he finally snaps and uses the tools that he has as a wrestler, as a grappler, as a fighter. And then he's just gone forever. So the kids who bullied him just are going to learn nothing. He's going to learn nothing. And there are just huge flaws in our system.
What they learn is that the system is going to protect the bully and punish the bullied,
For sure. Yeah.
And that, you're right, that's unacceptable. Okay, so I realize that I haven't asked like another question yet.
Oh yeah, sorry, go for it.
No, it's totally fine. I'm really enjoying this conversation. I think we kind of already talked about this, but is there anything else you want to say about why you write and why you became a writer?
So my mom is an oil painter in Tucson. And so like art was a calling, and she would always tell us about artists, but she just loved books and she would always read aloud to us. And she would even like if we drove across the desert somewhere, she would be like going 70 miles an hour and reading aloud to us while she drove. She was a really incredible multitasker. But she would do all the voices and she just read us everything from like really esoteric essays to the Chronicles of Narnia, anything. And she would have me memorize poems when I was a little kid. So my mom was like a huge influence on me as far as like thinking the authors were cool. And even when I was like trying really hard to be a cool high school kid, I still like liked books, and I still maybe not the book that was being assigned in the class. Like I remember we were supposed to be reading Catcher in the Rye, and I had a copy of Misery by Stephen King inside Catcher in the Rye in English during our reading time every day. So maybe it wasn't like the book that was assigned, but like I loved books and I thought authors were cool, because of my mom. And then when I got in so much trouble and finally didn't live with my family anymore, I lived with this other family, and so she's like kind of like my adopted mom, Pris, and she was a teacher, and she would come home from school every day and she'd be tired because she'd been interacting with little people all day long. She taught grade school, and she would just chain smoke and read every night for like 3 or 4 hours. And so I just saw her constantly reading books, and like if the book was good, she would just give it to me. And then I had an English teacher in high school, my last high school, the only high school I didn't get expelled from. And she just liked me for whatever reason, and she would always have me like she'd interview me and have me tell stories to the class, and like she'd walk up to my desk during class and put a book on my desk, or she'd take me out to coffee, or she'd walk up to my desk in high school and like set 2 tickets on my desk and say, take a pretty girl to this movie, you know? And so like I was like, oh, books are cool and nice people give you books, you know? And then in college, like my favorite professor was a poet. So, and she would have me over to her house, and I talked to her and her husband, who were both poets, and they'd like tell stories and we talk about baseball. And so I just thought like people who wrote books are the coolest people, and people who read books are the coolest people. So I want to be in that club. Like I want to read books and write books and do that thing for sure.
So you teach creative writing, right?
I'm not this year.
Not this year.
Yeah, they
So
asked me.
I'm just curious. I'm just curious about your own like your own writing process, like as somebody who would teach writing, you know, and especially in like a workshop setting. I'm just curious about what you do, like what your process is like, and then also like if you have any sort of recommendations for teaching writing for teachers who might be, you know, listening or watching this, if you have any sort of advice or go-to moves in the classroom.
Um, I have an exercise that I do pretty early on, like once the students trust me a little bit, but pretty early, because I'm trying to get them to like write the real, because we really don't want to be very vulnerable or honest in our writing. And it doesn't have to be nonfiction. Like, at least for me and for most of the writers that I interact with, like when they start writing fiction, they don't write things that are very real because they don't want to get too close to the truth. Or they write like semi-autobiographical, but they're a hero character, you know, and or their best friend who they really love is actually the hero, or something that's like true but not true.
Right.
So one thing we do is I hand out a piece of paper and I tell them right off the bat, like, we're not going to turn this in. At the end, you're not going to give it to anybody. Nobody's going to see it. We're not revising this. We're not doing anything. And then they write the worst thing that they've ever done in their entire life, like the thing they're most ashamed of. And we all write it out, and it's really hard. And then we all just rip it into tiny, tiny, tiny shreds. And I walk around with a trash can and we all throw it out, you know? And it's like, well, if I can write that honestly, like I could be pretty honest about this, you know? So that's a good exercise. As far as like with my students, I always try to teach them to finish drafts, re-envision and really re-envision a second draft. Like I'll do drills like you have to cut half of what you wrote and then write it back to the full length with new material. And so that's kind of hard for them, so that they really learn to revise rather than, like you said, just fixing grammar. And then, you know, I try to teach them little tricks that strengthen their sentences, like sometimes allowing the subject to be assumed, like starting sentences with verbs, you know, or little tricks like that that make poetry or poetic novelistic writing much better and stronger. Trying to write an entire fictional scene without a single adverb, you know, things that are difficult for me, for everybody, because we speak in so many adverbs. And then like also like using their phones to record their friends talking and then writing out the dialogue as it is, you know, like, so you learn how people actually talk. Because the worst thing in a novel is when you're like, nobody says these things ever, you know? Like, so, you know, actually having them like record a conversation and realize like, oh my gosh, we speak in so many half sentences and there's like awkward pauses and then there were hand motions. And so they can start to write that in. Like Cormac McCarthy is really good at that. You know, he'll write a scene where the wannabe police officer is like smoking and trying to do a hand gesture that he's seen somebody else do, you know, half sentence and then do the hand gesture and then speak another half sentence and awkwardly do the same hand gesture. But we do those kinds of things. So
one of the things that I really appreciated actually about Two Shattered Fermenting is that it taught me something about like my own rural language variety.
That's
in
cool.
that in that I recognized through like reading, but also hearing little talk, how often I drop the subject of a sentence after the subject has already been introduced.
Yes.
Um, and so like, I think I had just read a passage or something, and then I was talking either to like my mama or my mom and papa or somebody. I was talking to somebody on the phone. It might have been my sister. I can't remember. And I realized that I said one sentence that had the subject in it, and like every other sentence I said after that started with a verb and had the subject was assumed that I was still talking about the first thing that I was talking about.
Yeah.
And he does that all the time.
Yep.
And I just was like, and then when I whoever I was talking to was talking back to me, I noticed that they did the exact same thing. And so I
Yeah.
was just like, and then I started thinking about it, and I'm like, we do this all the time. And
Yeah.
I have never noticed that before. And then when I don't know if you had time or inclination, I guess, to watch the summary video where I do the reading of the first pages. But I asked a friend to give me some feedback on like my podcast format and like, do you feel like you are missing visuals and stuff? And he was like, what was really interesting is that like when you started reading the first pages, your voice just completely changed into somebody that I feel like I've never really listened to before, because you just sounded more rural. Like you just sounded like more like yourself.
Yes, it's
Um,
hidden there.
and I was like, you're not the first person to say that to me. I feel like every time, like if a writer gets it right, you know, that it's impossible for me to sort of read it in like my academic voice. And I
Yeah.
end up reading it in a voice that I would use more like with my family. Um, and so I think like that might be another good test. Like after you write dialogue of, that belong to the identities of your characters, do readers who also identify that way, like, do they recognize it in themselves? Like, do they even, I embody it through like the way that I read the words. um and so I just think that's really interesting, and it's another thing that I just really loved about Too Shattered from Ending.
That makes me happy. Thank you. I I really appreciate that. I was spending a lot of time in peers and it was writing down how people were talking. And like I noticed that rhythm and I was like, oh, that's something that we're all doing. Like we're all doing the same thing. And so I was like, okay, I'm just gonna do that for the whole book. And I didn't honestly, what's cool is like you're such a good reader because sometimes we do things as writers and we think like everyone's gonna catch it and then nobody catches it. And so then you're like, man, it would be cool if like one reviewer would say something about, but you know, sometimes it doesn't work out.
But there is a different cadence. There is a different rhythm. There's a different cadence to the way that I talk to my family. And way different than like standard academic English. And that's true of Spanish. That's true of so many other, like there's just a difference in the way that you say things.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe the hard thing about some people who've lived in, multiple situations is that you have to code switch. It's like the way that I talk to my logger fishing buddy is not the way that I talk to my students, is not the way that I talk to my dogs. Like we got like all this code switching going on. And then I go to New York, and what I finally decided is that like with my last trip to New York, I didn't even try to dress up. I didn't even try to pretend like I was anybody comfortable with New York. I don't want to live in New York. I'm really grateful that my publisher sends me there sometimes to do book events, and that's super cool. But what I end up doing is like the last time I was there, I had 10 book events, 2 each day for 5 days in a row, and the middle of the day off. And every single day I went into Central Park in the middle of the day because like I just had to get away and had to find like an outdoor space. Um, and so now I just don't even pretend like I haven't even been code switching when I go to New York. I'm just like, I'm just gonna be who I am, and I'm not a New Yorker. Like, I don't know. But the
And
first time I went, I definitely code switched and I dressed up and I had the tie on and I tried to speak the way they wanted me to. And it was terrible.
yeah, it just feels so it just feels uncomfortable, you know. And
Yeah.
I on my blog I wrote about this, like being in an urban PhD program. I didn't pass my first review because they misunderstood the way that I entered into conversation.
Wow.
Because I'm a cooperative overlapper, so a lot of that was seen as interruption. And they felt like I was intimidating other students into not speaking because I was interrupting. And
Wow.
I also tend to say exactly what I think.
Oh
Um,
no.
because that's I mean, when you grow up on a farm and you're in a rural place, like people don't have time.
Yeah.
People don't have time to like sugarcoat or candy coat. It's just like, this is what I need from you. This is what you need from me. Let's do this thing and let's get out of here.
Yeah.
You know, like
Yeah.
it's not, unless it's like dinner time, unless it's like a meal time, that's where stories happen, around the fire, whatever. Like that's where the stories happen. That's where the time is taken. But in like everyday communication interaction, it's just like you just say what needs to be said, and that's
Mhm.
fine. You know, that's
Yeah.
acceptable.
Yeah.
That's not the case in a lot of academic spaces. And I learned that the real hard way. But anyway, so I started thinking about like how we don't really, like, I feel like the only rural language variety that has been studied is Appalachian English.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of overlap probably from there, just because of how many people sort of out migrated Appalachia and went to other places, like my family. But I just think I don't really ever remember hearing a teacher sound like me. I remember being told that the way that my family talked was unintelligent, even though that I knew they were really smart people.
Yeah.
But I don't remember, even though I had teachers who were from rural spaces, they never code switched. So I made sure in my class with my rural students that I did. I was very intentional about that, but I don't know that I did it enough. But yeah, this is something that I think about a lot. How language connects to our identities, and how that connects to place and what that means for the way that we teach and the way that students learn, and what that means about linguistic justice,
Yes.
that kind of stuff. So, but I really, it feels so validating, right? That there's someone else in the world who notices it, who thinks about it, who,
Yeah.
and that it's like not just me, you know?
Yeah. I can't believe you caught that. That's really cool because you are the first person who's mentioned it. But
Oh, really?
I did it on purpose, but
I
nobody's ever mentioned it back to me.
I figured that you did. I mean, I think probably the first one, and I think it was like he was talking about like a conversation that was occurring or something like that, and he was talking about like who he was talking to, and then he left, like, it wasn't I said or I say, it was just say, because he
Mhm.
didn't need to use the pronoun anymore, because we all know that he was talking about him, again, sort of
Mhm.
like that economy of language, right?
Yeah.
um and it came up again and again, and I was just like, this is exactly how I talk. Like, this is exactly how we talk to each other. This is awesome.
That's so cool.
um do you have future projects that you want to talk about, things you're excited about and can't talk about, or anything like that?
Yeah, I'm writing, well, I wrote because books come out so much later than you,
I know.
right? But I wrote my first thriller and you know, like the two book deal I did with Knopf with Random House, this was like a young adult that dealt with drug addiction and struggle, but kind of became a little bit of a weird romance, both between him and the girl that he's romantically interested in, but also really understanding his love for his best friend,
Mm.
you know? And I wrote that after one of my friends died. And so I really wanted to I wanted to write about friendship and how complex friendship is and what love looks like between two boys who are straight but also love each other, you know? And and so that was interesting. And my editor really wanted that to be the same kind of book I did next. And then I turned into Shattered for Mending. And she was like, this is like a gritty rural mystery almost, you know, like and I was like, is that bad? And she's like, and also it's like supposed to be a young adult book, but it feels like an adult book to me. And then the New York Times said it was a crossover. And so it was like this whole thing, you know, could they promote it as young adult? It had a lot of bad language. um,
Go to the hallways in high schools.
yeah, exactly. But yeah, I got a note. Actually, it was for this book, but I got a note from my editor that said, did you know there are 209 swear words in this book? And I was like, well, is that enough? You know? But okay, so I wrote like the kind of like romance young adult book, and then the crossover young adult mystery gritty rural book, and then my next book actually um was almost a thriller. So my agent said, what do you think about reading some thrillers and watching some thrillers and making this fully into a thriller? And I was like, I don't really know anything about that. And you know, and I'm working with Yishai Seidman. He's a wonderful agent. Um, and he was excited about it. He read the draft, and I made it into a thriller. And so that's coming out in December of 2022. And I based the girl in American Afterlife on my daughter, Rue, who I call Tortuga. Um, and she's just kind of like a badass survivor girl. And it's after the 9.2 Cascadia quake hits the Northwest. And so I got to research all these like real details about like dams failing and floods and where would you be in the city if you lived, and you know, and then she decides to stay behind to try to find her mother, and there's a cult that also stays in the city, and so for a different reason, and so you know, it's not safe for this single person out there in the world. But it was really fun to write too.
One of the things that we haven't really talked about that I wanted to talk about, in terms of like not only just what happens in Too Shattered for Mending, but you also address it in your author's note, is sort of the aspect of race, and thinking about like how race and racism, like there's this really, really complex, like the stereotype of rural people as racists exists for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
But also not all rural people are racist.
Right, definitely not.
And
Yeah.
so like thinking about Big and like his generation and his interactions with Little, and then, you know, Little sort of reckoning with his own racial identity and how he is racialized and sometimes isn't racialized, like within the town and within the course of the novel. Like that's one of the things that I'm trying to think about through this project too, is like not every rural person is a white person. And so then, you know, what does that mean for how we teach it, how we write it, how we read it? Like, I was just curious. I suppose this maybe doesn't sound like a question, but just thinking about that sort of dance of making sure that we're not playing into deficit narratives of all rural people as racist, but also recognizing that there is racism in rural towns and trying to capture like how someone with a racialized identity navigates that space. I think that's also fairly personal for you. And so I was just curious if you want to talk a little bit about that and maybe how teachers can sort of work toward progress in terms of that in their classroom with books like this.
Wow, that's a good, deep question. So many things. I mean, maybe I'd start with like, instead of rural people are racist, I would just say like, everybody's racist, or everybody everywhere stereotypes, or like you just, if you think you're not racist, you probably haven't met the race that you stereotype yet, you know? And then if you were, you know, if you were with people that you feel comfortable with and that race that you don't know is suddenly there, like you would probably be making stereotypes or having some kind of thought that's probably racist. And I think like the work of anti-racism is just saying, I need to be conscious of my bias. I need to be conscious of where I stereotype. I need to be conscious of where I'm racist so that I can intentionally try to change the patterns of my own thinking, you know? And so instead of like everybody in Pierce, Idaho is racist, I didn't want that to be like, that's not the narrative, you know, like everybody's there, they're racist. You know why? Because they're white or mostly white, or because they're rural, or it's just like, that's lazy. I went to a school in New York, and I was a scholarship athlete there. And so on our dorm floor, I was the only white person, you know, and like they had all these racist stereotypes about white people, but also I was the only person from Oregon. And so they would make fun of how I talked and how I was like a country hick and all these different things, you know. And they were completely racist with me, but like I had all these racial stereotypes about them, you know, probably. So I don't know. You know, and I'm Swedish, and I'm Swiss, and I'm Mexican, and I think I mostly look Swedish. I don't know. I get tanner than most of my white Northern European friends. Or sometimes people say things like, "Wait, you're not quite white, are you?" You know, like, or funny things like that. And it's like, well, I'm a little bit Mexican, you know, and that's why all my friends and family call me Pedro, you know. But my first agent really wanted me to be Peter Brown Hoffmeister, and that's fine, you know. Like she thought that was a more formal sounding name than Pedro Hoffmeister, and I tried to talk to her about switching, and she was just like, "Yeah, I don't feel comfortable with that name." Like it was two different things. But like, wouldn't it be cool if we could all be many things? And I don't know. It was cool to write a character who was trying to figure out like what's his place if he mostly looks white but he's a little bit Mexican, you know.
And like
In
everyone knows it,
Yes,
you know, like
yeah, because in the real Pierce, Idaho, there is one person that everybody in town calls the Mexican, but he's from El Salvador, right? And that is totally racist, right? But also he's a beloved member of the community, and everyone treats him with dignity and respect, as they also use a racist name to name him, you know. So it's like I thought it was an interesting space to put a character who was struggling with like, you know, what do I know and who am I, and which is really what all of us are struggling with.
yeah, I mean
And
even adults, even though we
yeah,
like to pretend that adults have it all figured out, that's not true.
yeah, I was actually just talking to my friend Brendan Leonard this morning about that. Like that's another thing that we're supposed to think that older people are wiser, but like a lot of the old people I know give me really bad advice and have really terrible world views, you know. Whereas, and on the flip side, like I have teenagers that I teach that I would go to for advice because they're very wise humans, you know. So I think maybe like, oh, you asked me for advice, but I feel like I'm not giving good advice. Maybe we all just approach this like way more humbly
Mm.
and try to learn from each other and be cooperative in our learning. I mean, I've learned more from my students, I'm sure, than they've ever learned from me. But
I think we just have this drive of like categorization and hierarchies that for some reason we're just obsessed with assigning values and betterness to
yeah,
things,
right.
which is really problematic. But I, on a personal level, I also appreciate that about this book because my husband is Gujarati. His parents are from Gujarat in India, and so my children are, you know, half white and half Gujarati, and you know, my oldest looks a little more like his family, and my youngest looks a little more Teutonic, and you know, and so like I just think about their experiences and what that's going to look like in school, and you know, my oldest name is Adeline Parton Patel, so we hyphenated our last names so that we're both in there. But you know, she has a really old-timey like white name, and my son's name is Leland, and it's a really old-timey white name, but his last name also is Parton Patel. And so like
That's great.
Like, yeah,
right?
like
Like,
why, if they want to grow up to be writers, like I would just hate the thought of somebody being like, why don't we just drop the Patel and you'll just be Adeline Parton and that will be your writing name. And it's just like, no, like let her be who she is.
yeah. And later I worked with this wonderful second agent. She was great. And my third agent's great. And you kind of bounce through. But then you have to still go back because you've already put writing out there under a name. And you're like, but I'm really more comfortable with this name. You know, I've been, you have to be comfortable with lots of different things. But,
But I
but
mean, I
my
think that,
daughters, my wife is Northern European and Cherokee, and
mhm.
then one of her Cherokee, she has lots of Cherokee ancestors, but one of them also um, married a free slave from the South who'd moved to Oklahoma Territory. And so my daughter Rue, people think, they always are like, you're mixed, right? You're mixed, right? They think she's like sort of black, and she's got really tan skin and curly hair, the dreadlocks.
Mhm.
My other daughter looks like she's from Sweden. She's like blonde and like it's freckles across her, like, and they don't even look, nobody believes that they're sisters ever. And but that's like, that's so cool. They are, we know they are. And I don't know. It's just variation's much more interesting than like everything being the same.
Well, but yeah, so I just think, that's kind of an area that I'm also wanting to explore. And I thought that it was a really important part of this book. And I just was curious to hear you talk a little bit about it. So thank you for being
Yeah.
willing to sort of be vulnerable in your thought process, and sort of like thinking out loud.
I don't know if I have any wisdom, but I'll I'll work on it.
I think even just thinking through the question and even like posing the question, hopefully like other teachers, including rural teachers, will sort of like pose the question to themselves and think more about that in their practice. And as somebody who's preparing future teachers, this is something that I'm also thinking about. So the question is kind of selfish because
Yeah.
because I'm also thinking about it in my practice, and I just I like to hear other writers and to hear educators talk about it. So I
Mhm.
really appreciate you sharing. Um, I know you said you got to go, so I just want to say thank you so much for spending all of this time talking to me. It's been a blast for me. It's been an absolute joy, and I cannot say enough good things about Too Shattered for Mending. It will be a book that I read again. And I hope that everybody who's watching this goes out and tries to find themselves a copy and reads it, because I think that everyone should.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate you reading and having me on and promoting. I appreciate it. Thank you.